Sometimes the person who saves your life doesn't come running when you call. Sometimes they walk through a courtroom door 15 years later. The courtroom had already decided how the story would end. Reporters lined the back wall with cameras lowered, waiting for the final statement that would mark the collapse of Ashcroft Precision Systems, a manufacturing company that had spent nearly 2 decades building aircraft components trusted across America. Investors filled the gallery. Employees sat shoulder to shoulder in silence. Across the aisle, Vivian Holloway rested one hand on a polished leather folder, her expression calm enough to suggest the outcome had never been in doubt. Beside her, Sterling Knox, one of the country's most respected corporate litigators, closed his case with deliberate confidence. "Your Honor," he said, "the evidence is complete. There is nothing left to dispute." Judge Malcolm Avery lowered his reading glasses and glanced toward the defense table. Gideon Ashcroft remained seated, his charcoal suit neatly pressed, but noticeably older than those surrounding him. His hands rested quietly on the table. They were the hands of a man who had spent years building machines before he ever built a company. The silver wedding band he still wore caught the afternoon light for only a moment, before disappearing beneath his folded fingers. "Mr. Ashcroft," the judge said, "do you wish to make a final statement before this court reaches its decision?" Gideon lifted his eyes. His voice was steady. "No, Your Honor." A murmur moved through the room. Several reporters exchanged quick looks. Even a few employees lowered their heads. It sounded less like surrender than exhaustion. Judge Avery gave a slow nod and reached for the papers that would end everything. Then a sharp sound echoed across the marble floor. One pair of footsteps, measured, unhurried. Every conversation stopped. The heavy courtroom doors opened, and a young woman stepped inside carrying a single leather briefcase. She wore a navy suit without a wrinkle, her dark hair tied neatly behind her shoulders, and a state bar pin reflected beneath the courtroom lights. She did not look toward the cameras. She did not acknowledge the whispers spreading through the gallery. She walked directly to the center aisle and stopped. "Your Honor," she said clearly, "I respectfully request permission to appear on behalf of Mr. Gideon Ashcroft." Sterling Knox frowned. Vivian Holloway leaned forward for the first time that afternoon. Judge Avery looked down at the filing handed to the bailiff. His eyes narrowed slightly as he read the name. Alara Whitmore. Gideon stared at the young attorney, as though searching through years of forgotten memories. She met his eyes for only a second before offering the smallest smile. It was warm, familiar, almost impossible to place. Then she reached into her briefcase and carefully removed a faded blue knitted scarf, placing it gently on the defense table. Gideon's breathing caught. He had not seen that scarf in 15 years. 15 years earlier, the first snow of December arrived before sunset and settled across the sidewalks of Fairhaven, Pennsylvania, turning the streets white long before the Christmas lights came alive. Most people hurried home with grocery bags tucked beneath their coats, eager to escape the cold that had settled over the town since morning. A small girl moved in the opposite direction. She carried no suitcase. She owned no backpack. Her oversized blue scarf was wrapped around her neck 3 times, but it could not keep the wind from reaching her face. She had learned that looking people directly in the eyes usually earned a faster refusal. So she kept her head lowered as she walked from one storefront to another, quietly asking if anyone needed help sweeping snow or carrying boxes. By late afternoon, every answer had been the same. No. The bakery owner handed her half a dinner roll without a word. A grocery clerk pointed toward the church shelter across town, not realizing it had already filled before noon. She thanked them anyway. She always thanked people, even when they could not help. As daylight faded, she found herself standing beneath the awning of a small machine shop, where warm yellow light spilled onto the sidewalk. The sign above the entrance read Ashcroft Precision Repair, Through the front window, she watched a man tightening bolts on an industrial milling machine while an old radio played quiet country music in the background. Every tool hung perfectly straight against the wall. Every workbench had been cleaned before closing. Near the office door sat a small wooden table, covered with homework sheets, colored pencils, and an untouched glass of milk that had already begun forming a thin layer of cream on top. The little girl stared at the table longer than she realized. Gideon Ashcroft noticed her reflection in the glass. Before he noticed the snow collecting on the shoulders of her worn jacket, he switched off the machine, removed his work gloves, and walked to the entrance. When he opened the door, neither of them spoke immediately. Cold air rushed inside. She stepped back as though expecting to be told to leave. Gideon studied her for a moment, then looked down at the pair of shoes barely holding together beneath her feet. "Have you eaten dinner?" he asked quietly. The girl hesitated before giving the smallest shake of her head. Gideon nodded once. "Come inside before you answer anything else." She remained frozen where she stood. Not because she did not trust him, because it had been a very long time since anyone had invited her anywhere without expecting something in return. Gideon noticed that hesitation too. He simply stepped aside, leaving the doorway open. "It is warmer in here," he said. That is reason enough. For the first time in many months, the little girl took one careful step toward a place that felt like home. Even though neither of them knew it yet, Gideon did not ask for her name that first evening. He believed hungry children needed warm food before difficult questions. He placed a bowl of homemade chicken soup on the kitchen table beside fresh bread, and waited without speaking. The girl stared at the meal as though it might disappear if she reached for it too quickly. She ate slowly at first, then faster. Across the table, a 12-year-old boy watched in complete silence. His name was Rowan Ashcroft. Since losing his mother 3 years earlier, he had become protective of the quiet routines that held his small family together. He glanced toward his father more than once, searching for an explanation that never came. Gideon simply smiled at his son and poured another glass of water. The next morning Gideon left an extra toothbrush beside the bathroom sink without saying why. He packed 2 school lunches instead of 1. When Rowan noticed, he asked only one question. "Is she staying?" Gideon tightened the lid on a lunch container before answering. "She is staying today." Rowan accepted the answer, because his father never promised more than he knew. 3 weeks later a county social worker knocked on the front door, carrying a clipboard and a stack of forms. A neighbor had reported that an unidentified child was living in the house. The woman explained that without proper documentation, the girl would have to be transferred into state care until her case could be reviewed. The little girl quietly stepped backward into the hallway. She had heard those words before. Gideon listened without interrupting. When the social worker finished speaking, he invited her inside, offered her coffee, and placed every document he had already prepared on the kitchen table. School enrollment forms, medical appointments, temporary guardianship applications, references from teachers, neighbors, and the local pastor. He had spent every evening completing them, after the children had gone to bed. The social worker slowly lowered her clipboard. "You expected this visit," she said. Gideon nodded. "Children deserve stability," he answered. "Paperwork should never arrive before responsibility." Before leaving, the woman looked toward the frightened girl and smiled gently. "I believe you are exactly where you belong." After the front door closed, the girl finally spoke. "Were you afraid they would take me away?" Gideon looked at the workshop through the kitchen window, where unfinished machines waited for another day's work. "Every worthwhile thing in life can be tested," he said quietly. "That does not mean you stop building it." Months later the adoption process moved forward, and for the first time she carefully wrote the name Elara Ashcroft across top of a school notebook. before smiling to herself. She did not know it yet, but the lesson she remembered most was never about law. It was about standing calmly when doing the right thing became difficult. Years passed with the quiet rhythm of ordinary mornings, and somewhere along the way temporary became permanent. The adoption was finalized without a celebration, because Gideon believed families were built by daily choices rather than legal documents. Alara carried the Ashcroft name with growing confidence, until it no longer felt borrowed. Rowan stopped introducing her as his adopted sister. She was simply his sister. Outside the house, another transformation unfolded, one careful decision at a time. The small repair shop became too busy for one man. Local manufacturers began asking Gideon to build custom precision parts, instead of repairing worn equipment. He accepted only the work he knew he could finish without sacrificing quality. One customer became 3. 3 became 12. 5 years later, the workshop expanded into an abandoned warehouse on the edge of Fairhaven. Gideon purchased the building only after saving enough to pay nearly the entire price himself. Debt, he often said, should never become louder than good judgment. Success attracted attention that honesty rarely escaped. One spring morning, a purchasing executive from a national aerospace supplier arrived with an offer that of double would have company's annual revenue overnight. The contract required only one condition: Gideon would quietly substitute a lower-grade alloy that still met the minimum legal requirement, but cost significantly less to manufacture. The executive smiled as he slid the proposal across the conference table. "Nobody will ever know," he said. Gideon closed the folder without reading the final page. "Then someone will," he replied. "Me." The executive stood, thanked him for his time, and left. 2 weeks later, Ashcroft Precision Systems lost the largest contract in its history. Several employees worried the company had made a costly mistake. One board advisor privately questioned whether integrity could survive competition. Gideon gathered everyone on the production floor before the next shift began. He held up the rejected proposal without revealing the client's name. "We build parts that people trust with their lives," he said calmly. "The day we exchange trust for profit is the day this company stops deserving either." Nobody applauded. They simply returned to work. 8 months later, the same aerospace supplier announced a nationwide recall after another vendor had used the cheaper material Gideon refused to accept. Within days, a different manufacturer contacted Ashcroft Precision Systems, explaining they had been looking for a supplier known for choosing principles over convenience. That agreement became the largest contract the company had ever earned. Alara watched the entire journey unfold from a corner office, where she spent her summer breaks organizing files and delivering engineering drawings between departments. That evening she asked Gideon if he had known refusing the first offer would eventually lead to something better. He smiled while locking the office door. "No," he answered. "I only knew the wrong decision never becomes the right one, because it pays more." The first acquisition offer arrived on an ordinary Tuesday morning, inside a cream-colored envelope, without a company logo. Gideon opened it between production meetings, and found a proposal worth $180 million. He read every page before quietly folding the document and placing it back into the envelope. By lunchtime, his answer had already been delivered. Respectfully declined. Over the following months, more offers arrived. Different investment firms, different attorneys, different numbers. The answer never changed. Ashcroft Precision Systems was not for sale. 200 miles away, inside the executive boardroom of Holloway Dynamics, Vivian Holloway studied a digital map displaying every major aerospace supplier across the eastern United States. One company remained outside her control. She rested a silver pen against the screen, where Ashcroft Precision Systems appeared. "As long as Gideon Ashcroft remains independent," she said calmly, "nobody owns this market." Sterling Knox closed a binder without looking up. Then we stopped trying to buy the company, he replied. We change who controls it. Nobody in the room objected. Nobody needed to explain further. The strategy that followed unfolded slowly enough to appear ordinary. Consulting firms offered operational reviews. Minority investors quietly increased their ownership positions through legal purchases. 3 board members who had rarely agreed before suddenly voted together, with remarkable consistency. Gideon noticed the pattern long before anyone else mentioned it aloud. He said nothing. Instead, he began collecting board agendas, attendance sheets, and voting records inside a single file cabinet drawer. One rainy evening, an unfamiliar number appeared on Alara Whitmore's phone, just after she finished arguing a corporate compliance case in Washington. The caller did not introduce himself immediately. I worked inside Ashcroft Precision Systems for 11 years, the man finally said. I resigned 3 months ago because someone asked me to certify documents I believed were incomplete. Alara remained silent. The voice continued. I cannot tell you everything over the phone. But if your last name means what I think it means. Your father is about to lose his company. For reasons that have very little to do with business. 2 days later they met in a quiet coffee shop near Union Station. The former compliance officer slid a sealed envelope across the table. I cannot access the archived communications anymore, he explained. They are stored by an independent records custodian under federal retention requirements. Only a court order or lawful request can retrieve them. If anyone ever obtains those files, they will show exactly when this plan began. Alara did not open the envelope immediately. She looked through the CAF window for several seconds, before placing it carefully inside her briefcase. She had handled enough corporate disputes to recognize the difference between suspicion and evidence. One could raise questions. Only the other could change the outcome of a courtroom. At that moment she had neither. But for the first time, she knew where the truth had been waiting all along. The hearing did not begin with raised voices. It began with silence. By 9 o'clock every seat inside the courtroom had been filled. Employees who had spent decades beside Gideon occupied the last 2 rows. Their faces marked by uncertainty rather than anger. They had watched rumors become investigations. Investigations become lawsuits. And lawsuits become the possibility of losing everything they had helped build. Several avoided looking toward the defense table, because they no longer knew what to believe. Sterling Knox stood first. His presentation was calm, organized, and relentless. Every exhibit appeared exactly when expected. Financial statements, internal correspondence, board resolutions, meeting records, each document seemed to point toward the same conclusion. That Gideon had mismanaged corporate governance and ignored his fiduciary responsibilities. The accusations were not dramatic. They were methodical. That made them far more dangerous. Vivian Holloway never interrupted. She simply observed from her seat with complete confidence. She had learned long ago that victory often belonged to the person willing to wait. Gideon listened without objection. He reviewed each page before handing it back to his attorney. More than once his lawyer whispered that they should challenge the admissibility of certain exhibits. Gideon quietly declined. Only challenge what we know is false, he replied. The truth does not need unnecessary arguments. Hours passed. Witnesses entered. Witnesses departed. Directors testified about strategic disagreements. Outside consultants described restructuring recommendations. Shareholders explained why they believed new leadership had become necessary. Every statement appeared reasonable when heard alone. Together they formed a picture that became increasingly difficult to overcome. Shortly before the afternoon recess, Gideon's attorney requested permission to confer privately. They stepped into a consultation room, overlooking the courthouse plaza, where winter rain covered the windows in thin silver lines. The attorney removed his glasses and exhaled slowly. Unless something changes, he admitted, I do not see a path forward. Gideon thanked him for his honesty, instead of criticizing his conclusion. He poured 2 cups of coffee from the small machine in the corner and placed one on the table. "You have done your work," he said. "Now let the facts finish theirs." The attorney wanted to ask what facts remained, but Gideon's expression suggested the conversation had already ended. When court resumed, Judge Malcolm Avery reviewed the final submissions before folding his hands together. "The court has received all evidence presently before it," he said. "If neither party has additional matters to present, I am prepared to issue my ruling." Sterling Knox rose immediately. "The plaintiff rests, Your Honor." Every eye turned toward the defense. Gideon's attorney remained seated. Gideon slowly stood instead. The room became completely still. Judge Avery looked directly at him. "Miss Ashcroft," he asked, "is there anything further this court should consider before I render judgment?" Gideon looked across the courtroom one final time. His answer contained only 3 quiet words. "Nothing from me." The courtroom remained silent long enough for the clock above the bench to become the only sound anyone noticed. Then the rear doors opened. Every head turned at once. The young attorney walked forward, with measured confidence, carrying only a leather briefcase worn smooth along its edges from years of use. She stopped before the bench and handed a sealed appearance notice to the bailiff. Judge Malcolm Avery adjusted his glasses as he reviewed the filing. "Counselor Elara Whitmore," he read aloud. "Your request to appear is granted." Sterling Knox rose immediately. "Your Honor, the evidentiary phase has concluded." Elara did not look toward him. Respectfully, she replied, "The evidentiary phase concluded because the defense never received evidence intentionally withheld during discovery." A quiet murmur swept across the gallery. Vivian Holloway folded her arms but said nothing. Elara placed her briefcase on the defense table and carefully removed a worn blue scarf before laying it beside Gideon's hand. He stared at the faded fabric without speaking. A small section near one corner had been repaired with uneven stitching many years earlier. He remembered sewing it himself after finding a needle inside an old toolbox one winter evening. His eyes slowly lifted toward the young woman standing beside him. She smiled with the same quiet gratitude he had first seen in a frightened child who had stood outside his workshop, while snow covered the sidewalk. Gideon whispered only one word, "Elara." She nodded almost imperceptibly before turning back toward the bench. "Your Honor," she said, 15 years ago this man taught me something that became the foundation of my profession. He said the truth does not become stronger because it is louder. It becomes stronger because it survives examination." She opened a thin binder and removed a certified chain of custody report together with a series of electronic communication records that had never appeared during trial. These documents were preserved by a third-party compliance archive and recovered under federal retention requirements 3 days ago. Sterling Knox stepped forward. "Objection." Judge Avery raised one hand. "On what grounds?" Knox hesitated. "Relevance." Elara answered before the judge could speak. "These records establish coordinated communication between outside consultants and 3 board members weeks before the restructuring vote. They also demonstrate that material correspondence requested during discovery was never disclosed to this court." The judge examined the first pages in silence. His expression changed almost immediately. He looked toward the plaintiff's table. "Counselor Knox," he asked evenly, "were you aware these records existed?" For the first time since proceedings began, Sterling Knox did not answer immediately. Vivian Holloway's confidence faded almost imperceptibly as she realized the case she believed had already been won was about to be examined from an entirely different direction. Judge Malcolm Avery spent nearly 5 minutes reading the newly admitted records before placing them carefully beside the original case file. Nobody interrupted him. Nobody moved. The courtroom that had been filled with quiet confidence only moments earlier now felt suspended between 2 different versions of the truth. Alara waited without speaking. She had learned years ago that evidence should never compete with emotion. It should simply exist. Finally, the judge looked up. "Counselor Whitmore," he said, "please continue." She nodded once and connected the electronic communications to the voting schedule presented earlier by the plaintiff. Every message followed the same pattern. Private discussions occurred before official board meetings. Recommendations appeared in identical language across different directors. Draft resolutions existed days before the meetings where they were supposedly created. Then she displayed one final document, a compliance memorandum signed by an independent governance auditor who had resigned after refusing to approve the restructuring plan. The memorandum had never reached the shareholders because it had been removed from the official distribution package before the annual vote. Sterling Knox stood again, but this time his voice lacked its earlier certainty. "Your Honor, these conclusions require additional verification." Judge Avery looked directly at him. "Verification is exactly what this court has been requesting from the beginning." He turned another page before continuing. "What concerns the court is not merely the existence of these records, but the apparent failure to disclose material information during discovery." Vivian Holloway slowly leaned back in her chair. Her expression remained composed, but her eyes revealed the calculation of someone realizing that control had quietly slipped away. Several board members exchanged uneasy glances. One lowered his head. Another reached for a glass of water with an unsteady hand. Alara closed the binder before speaking again. "My client never asked this court for sympathy," she said. "He asked only that every fact be examined before judgment was entered. The integrity of a company cannot be measured only by financial statements. It must also be measured by the honesty of the process used to challenge it." Judge Avery removed his glasses and folded his hands. After reviewing the newly admitted evidence, this court finds that significant questions now exist regarding the conduct of the restructuring process and the completeness of prior disclosures. Accordingly, the requested transfer of corporate control is denied. Existing governance actions related to this proceeding are suspended pending further investigation. This matter is referred to the appropriate regulatory authorities for independent review. No applause followed. Only silence. It was the kind of silence that appears when certainty disappears. Reporters hurried toward the hallway. Employees slowly exhaled after holding their breath for what felt like hours. Gideon remained seated exactly where he had been. He did not celebrate. He simply looked at Alara with quiet gratitude. She returned the same calm smile she had carried into the room. Knowing the greatest victory that afternoon had never belonged to the courtroom. It had begun many years earlier around a small kitchen table, where one man chose kindness without expecting anything in return. The courthouse slowly emptied until only a handful of people remained in the quiet hallway. Employees gathered around Gideon, each waiting to shake his hand, but he greeted them the same way he always had. By asking about their families before discussing the company. Nothing about him suggested he had just preserved everything. He had spent 20 years building. When the last reporter finally walked outside, Alara remained near one of the tall windows overlooking the city. The blue scarf rested neatly across her arm. Gideon approached without hurry. For a long moment neither of them spoke. Then he smiled the way he had on that winter evening long ago. "You kept it," he said softly, looking at the faded stitches. Alara nodded. "I promised myself I would never lose the first thing that ever made me feel safe." Gideon gently touched the repaired corner of the scarf. He remembered sewing those uneven stitches after she had accidentally torn it while helping clear snow outside the workshop. He had forgotten many business meetings over the years. He had forgotten countless contracts. He had never forgotten that afternoon. Alara reached into her briefcase, one last time, and removed the old fountain pen he had given her before college. The scratches along its side had become smoother with time, but it still worked perfectly. She placed it carefully into his hand. "You told me people might admire intelligence," she said, "but character is what they would trust." Every decision I made in that courtroom started with those words. Gideon looked down at the pen before quietly slipping it into his jacket pocket. Outside, the late afternoon sun finally broke through the clouds for the first time that day. Several weeks later, the regulatory investigation confirmed that the restructuring process had been compromised, and new independent directors were appointed to restore confidence throughout the company. Gideon accepted every recommendation that strengthened transparency, even when it required changing systems he had built himself. He often reminded his leadership team that protecting a reputation required the same honesty as earning one. Months passed. Ashcroft Precision Systems continued growing, but the most meaningful announcement arrived without investors or cameras. A new scholarship program opened in Fairhaven for children who had experienced homelessness or unstable housing. Its mission was simple: education, mentorship, and opportunity. No publicity campaign, no grand ceremony. Only open doors. On the dedication plaque near the entrance appeared a single sentence chosen by Ilara. "One act of kindness can become someone else's future." Visitors often assumed the words belonged to a famous writer. Gideon always smiled and said they came from an ordinary father who believed every life deserved another chance. Years after the courtroom had faded into memory, young students filled the scholarship center each afternoon, carrying notebooks, questions, and dreams that reached far beyond the small town where everything began. Gideon would sometimes watch them from a nearby bench, before quietly heading home, knowing the greatest thing he had ever built had never been a company at all. It had been the courage to change one child's life, and through her, countless others.